So we've been talking together about learning to read the Bible devotionally rather than reading it merely informationally or reading it theologically. We've been talking about trying to read the Bible prayerfully, devotionally, asking God questions like, what do you have for me here? What do you want me to do? How do you want me to think? How do you want me to view myself and the world around me? And I thought maybe we could do a series of devotionals from 1 Peter chapter 1. We're reading the first verse. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. And right away, I'm stopped in my tracks, and I'm grabbed by this thing that Peter says to his readers. He calls them elect exiles of the dispersion. Other English translations call them strangers in the world, scattered, temporary residents, dispersed. And yet another says those who reside as aliens and scattered. And two thoughts came to me. The first is this: Peter is writing to people who are not at home. They are only living temporarily where they are. They're planning on going someday to their permanent home when they're finished here on earth. And this made me reflect. I wonder if Western Christians in the 21st century can identify with these first century Christians in any way. Now, this wouldn't have been a strange idea for the people who were first reading Peter's letter. These Jewish believers who received it were familiar with being unwelcome and not at home. These people were hounded. They were hunted. They were driven out. They didn't share in the cultural practices or the values of the people with whom they lived. They had strange ways. They had odd worship practices. They just didn't fit in. And we know that when people don't fit in, they find it hard to be accepted. They have very difficult lives. They're treated like outsiders, and that's what they felt like. So these are people who are not at home. These are people who are outsiders, people who are expecting to go to their permanent home when they're finished with things here on earth. But the second thing I noticed here is this theme of being scattered or dispersed. Again, another familiar concept for Peter's readers. The Jewish people had their own diaspora. They already had a scattering. There were Jewish people living all over the known world. There were still Jewish people living in Babylon who had never returned from exile. The Jews were scattered all across North Africa, Asia, all across southern Europe. These people had moved because of conquest. They had moved because of conflict. Some had just moved for business opportunities. And where were they living? Peter tells us, in places like Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. They already knew what it meant to be scattered. But these Jewish families, these Jewish families still had a homeland. They could still return to Judah if they wanted to. They still had a home. But these Christians who are reading Peter's letter had no place where they could go, where they could be at home. They had no homeland on earth. Anywhere they went, they would be strangers. They would be aliens. Think about this. God had saved them right where they lived, in any of these regions. One day they were living there with friends and family in a community in their own homes. And then they heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. And they believed it, and they placed their faith in Christ, and they became Christ followers. They became Christian people. And suddenly, they were strangers. Right in their own homes. They were aliens. They were no longer accepted. They were no longer recognized as part of the community. They were no longer home. They had no homeland on earth. there was no place in the world that was called Christian land. And this struck me and made me again start asking questions. Can we understand what it means to be a stranger or an alien right where we live? Do we live like strangers? Do we live like people who are not staying here permanently, like temporary residents of our communities? Are we people who are longing for the day and the opportunity when we can finally go to our permanent homes? Are there any differences between us and our neighbors? Do we stand out in any way? Now, I don't want to say that we should start doing things just to annoy our neighbors so that we'll stand out from them. I'm not talking about any kind of, false persecution complex here. But will I learn to think differently? Will I learn to set my mind on things above, my heart on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God? Will I learn to love the things in this world less than I do now? Will I ever come to the point here where I'm looking forward to going to my permanent home? Thanks again for listening. I sure appreciate you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon.